Let me introduce our next speaker, Christopher Newfield, who is the distinguished professor of English, or was the distinguished professor of English at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He's now the director of research at the Independent Social Research Foundation in London. He probably has a lot of experience with the weather we're dealing with now. He was the past president of the Modern Language Association. He's a multidisciplinary scholar. His research interests are critical university studies, literary criticism, innovation studies, and intellectual and social effects of the humanities. Dr. Newfield has written a trilogy of books on the university as an intellectual and social institution, the most recent of which was The Great Mistake, how we wrecked public universities and how we can fix them. A bunch of folks in this room have read that book and liked it a great deal. He also blogs on a higher education policy at Remaking the University and has written for Huffington Post, Inside Higher Ed, and the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, because I can't hear you. Hi, I'm glad to be here. I have very fond memories of a visit that I paid to you all in 2019, and I'm glad to have a chance to pick up some of those themes. I really agree with some of the points that the last two speakers were making. The first involving the need to organize higher education institutions around the students that we have and their needs and their intellectual as well as personal needs. And then also the second speaker, Gary, I'm sorry, I don't know your last name, about organizing for power. We learned this lesson in the 2010s where there are all sorts of good ideas floating around, and they really did not get very far with our various state legislatures. So I'm going to talk today about a theme, some themes that I think are not working so well, and then one that I'm hoping is going to work better, and it has to do with educational quality and maybe getting some more leverage out of that, and also building the concept of educational quality on the legacy of public institutions that we can really work with. I have a talk that is in length completely out of proportion to what we were just hearing, and so I'm not sure if I completely understand what your needs are, but I'm gonna carry on, and if it's going too long, if you're running out of time, if you need to cut the discussion, somebody will let me know. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, which is disabled. I wanted to show you some slides. Is it possible to authorize that? The host has to do it.
You should be able to share now.
Excellent. Sorry, let me there, how's that? Can you see the whole slide? The slide fills the screen. Yes, okay. Thanks for the arm wave. Okay. I just wanted to say something in the beginning about my background. I'm a second generation college person. I grew up in Los Angeles. My parents who also born and raised there, were the first and only members of their families, of their generation, to get bachelor's degrees. My mother ended up teaching or attending UC Santa Barbara in the 1950s when it was still a teacher's college, and she went on to be a first grade teacher, a teacher of reading in particular. What I saw when I was growing up, comparing my parents to other members of my family, was that college had transformed their lives. And the question that I kept asking myself as I was, especially the last couple of decades that I taught at UCSB, really starting after the cuts that began in 2003, is can we not have, in a state that is quite a bit wealthier in 2003 than it was, say, in 1953, when my mother was attending a pretty small college, why can we not have the same cheap, great thing that now in California, when 70% of our students are students of color, as we had when our high school students were 85% white? I mean, that just the idea of structural racism, it's not a good answer. So it just seemed important to me to continue to pose the question and to constantly raise the possibility of alternative structures in relation to what I had actually lived through in a very kind of concrete way. The thing that I attribute college completion to is their sense that not just that they had more money, but that they had a different sense of who they were in relation to the outside world. They had a different sense of possibility of their own futures. They had a real interest in people. They had interest in travel, that is, in people that were not like them. They had an interest in addressing social conflicts, not just running away from them, but trying to figure out how they worked and what they meant and dealing with them. Now, my parents were both Republicans, so it was just not tied to a particular political position, but they had a sense that problems can be analyzed and they can be solved. And it was a kind of a optimism in spite of, the usual slings and arrows of everybody's everyday lives that they passed on to us. And it was very much tied to education. I'm just going to say one more thing now about my very elderly mother. She's 93, and we just moved her for the first time into assisted living after staying in her own house for at least 10 years after she was declared legally blind. And there are, looking back at that period, at least two reasons why she was able to stay in her own home. One is that she functions very well with people, which again is part of that socialization process. And the other is that she maintained a kind of a passionate interest in news, politics, climate policy, pandemic responses, presidential races, the war in Ukraine, you name it, she is up to date on it, more even than I am. She has stayed especially interested in how life is for young people today, meaning that she has an interest in the experiences of people who are 70 or 80 or 90 years younger than she is. So you're asking yourself, so am I really attributing this particular feature of curiosity to her bachelor's degree? And the answer is yes, I am. And I'm not saying that people that stop before they graduate from high school or only graduate from high school don't have these features. They certainly do. But college helped her see the world as an interconnected system, and also to see people, and I mean all people, as improvable, as educable, people that can always go from doing nothing or doing the wrong thing to doing the right thing. It's intelligence, and it's the miracle of intelligence. And, given human nature, intelligence is always a kind of miracle. And it needs continuous cultivation. And that is why we have set up these very elaborate systems of education that start, pre-K to K through primary and secondary. All of them are essential to this process of turning people from reactors and fearers to people who can analyze, understand, communicate, interact, all the things that we talk about every day when we're in our roles as educators. The thing that university, college does is it helps people evolve skills to a kind of a higher level of the kind that societies now desperately need, as much as they did in the 1940s or in any other period, to face their problems and actually solve them. Okay, so I know when I say all this that I'm saying things that I think that we all know, but the issue that we face today is, are we going to act on our knowledge about the need for higher intelligence across the whole of society? Or will we let our common capacity to acquire and use higher intelligence narrow and shrink? Is it going to go back to affluent people, white people, to suburban people mostly, where other groups get a second tier or third tier version of what affluent white people are getting? The last 30 years, I think, has produced the wrong answer to this question. And the mistakes that we've made during this period, I mean, this is the good news, such as it is, our mistakes can actually be undone. Okay, so again, I just want to emphasize we can and should fully respect our non-college friends and neighbors and family members. We all live in communities that are very mixed in terms of levels of education. And I have to add that it takes brains and it takes guts to do well as most high school grads and even non-high school grads are now doing in today's society, which is stacked against them. But I think we must still be clear about the differences so that we can articulate either in policy, context, or anywhere else, the difference that tertiary makes, that going beyond high school makes to people's intellectual, personal, and social capabilities. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to show you some pictures to kind of set the tone, at least the tone that I try to feel when I write about this, because it's otherwise kind of depressing. This is the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign shot that I took when I was there about 5 years ago. I don't know how many of you have been there or come from there, but it's a middling landscape. It is not interesting. And the university transformed it into something that was really quite different and distinctive and special. This is the Spelman College Arch, another extremely special institution. The college is a kind of a keyhole through which you can see the future, your future, but also the future of your wider society. This is the Berkeley Campanile, the Bay Area, and the now unfortunately replaced with an unaffordable football structure, their old stadium. And this is Ansel Adams. It's truth and beauty combined. There's the intimation of some kind of glorious destiny that is connected not only to football, but also to the centers of learning and thought and conversation and interaction that lie behind that, and then behind that to the city where everybody lives, and gradually and too slowly, people that live in West Oakland could end up going to Berkeley after years and years of being excluded from that. There's a sense of mixture, and I should add that when this picture was taken around in 1964, Berkeley was essentially open admission. If you had taken the high school coursework, you could get in, and that was the beginning and the end of that. This is September 26, 1965. This is where the first class of Santa Cruz students registered. So it's clearly aspirational. It turned into this later through the work of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And I guess another way of putting the point that I'm making here is that when you look at pictures like this, we're looking at things that exceed calculable market benefits, right? We're looking at combinations of craft, skill, joy, aspiration, in conjunction with organized work of the kind that we do in colleges and universities, and that we teach students to do, and that students in turn help us do better by teaching us what they know. And then here is the CSU picture that I don't know if maybe I didn't take this picture. I took a lot of pictures when I was there. This might be a website shot. Again, what I'm seeing here is progress that is local and regional and national. It's focused on people of the community. It brings in people from outside. It creates a mixture, and it's aspiring to some kind of equitable development, in which all the communities that live there and come there can be developed equally. Okay, this is not I don't know. It may sound a little bit off center now, but what I've been saying so far was absolutely mainstream at various crisis periods in U.S. history. And the crisis period that produced the system that we're now struggling to not only save, but also improve, was developed in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So we all know the history of the GI Bill in 1944. And I just want to emphasize really the key thing about that, which was that it paid everybody. You didn't have to take an SAT test to be eligible for this. It was racialized, and that was a problem that took way too long to fix. In terms of academic qualifications and the concept of education, it was democratic for whites, at least, and it paid people to go to college. That is, it covered housing, it covered tuition, And it offered people a year of unemployment benefits to replace the lost wages that otherwise might have enticed them to go directly back into the workforce. So we have racialization problems, we have settler colonial origins that we must continue to repair. And yet we have a public good understanding of what higher education does, not just high school, but also universities, that was rebooted after World War II and was supported by Republicans as much as it was supported by Democrats. Okay, so the question we might ask many years later is, why would both parties and a wide range of members in them support this? And I think the reason is relatively simple, which is that those generations knew what it was like to have their societies torn apart by hatreds fueled by grotesque concentrations of wealth and power. They had seen World War I, and then 2 decades later, they had to endure World War II. They knew the damage that inequality could do. They knew what reversing living standards did to societies. They knew what cultural, racial, and religious ignorance could do. They wanted to end all that forever, and higher education and universal access to it was part of the strategy. So as part of that strategy of creating universal access, they made college free. They created what is still this impossible dream in 2023 in the 1940s, free college. And again, by they, I mean the Republican governor of California, Earl Warren, and many other Republicans and conservatives, as well as liberals and leftists. If you read a 1940s document like the Truman Commission report, Higher Education for American Democracy was its title, you see the work of leaders who had arrived at the belief that the universal college access was the key to ensuring peace and democracy throughout the world. The cost of this higher education would be borne by society, not by the individual, just like the cost of primary and secondary school is. And the reason was that most of the wider benefits were to return to society in the first place. So it was logical. It wasn't a huge political leap. Free college was debt-free. It was freedom of the economic kind for the individual. Higher education was to be for democracy, and 2 effects in particular were sought with this. First was the development of intellectual capabilities that could be joined with practical skills. So liberal arts, practical arts, thought and creativity joined together with practical application and learning from practice, as well as learning from theory. Second was the intellectual and personal capabilities that allowed for life in a democratic society, reading complicated ballot measures, arguing with your friends without getting in fistfights. That meant cultural knowledge. It meant interest in and not just toleration for social differences. It meant an embrace of racial pluralism, which is, of course, one of probably the single heaviest lift that American society continues to face. It meant being able to listen to and understand people you don't like, people you don't agree with, people that are coming literally and figuratively from a completely different place. What we later call STEM knowledge was certainly important, but non-STEM knowledge was just as important. And if you read this Truman report, you'll be surprised at the emphasis on the connection between the humanities and democratic life, as well as economic prosperity. The cost of all this was to be paid by society, to repeat, again, because the main benefit was social. It was a collective benefit. So the question is always, well, you don't like paying taxes? How do you like hatred, carnage, slaughter, hunger, destitution, torture, authoritarianism, and holocausts? The choice for that generation was simple. Society would not force individuals to bear the cost of an education that would benefit the entire society, first and foremost by allowing it to survive, because that would cut most people out of higher education, which would defeat the whole idea. So free college was democratic college and was widely understood as such. And these were just obvious points rather than huge progressive bench pressing of the kind that we're having to do now. Okay, so those people had a lot of limitations, and racism, gender inequality, and homophobia are 3 reasons why none of us want to go back there. But they were serious people. And I mean, I would just say, we today should be so serious. we should have the same clarity about how serious the problems are that we face, climate just being one of many. Okay, so there's a understanding of what universities do that I've been just kind of ventriloquizing now, and you can put it in a chart, and when economists do it, it looks like this. Okay, economists grant the existence of not just return on financial investment in your future wage as the result of going to university. So there's kind of a 2x2. There's pecuniary or monetary benefits, and then there's non-monetary benefits, and economists fully acknowledge the existence of these and also their importance. Then there are private benefits, and over here where you might expect to see the word public or social, you have the word instead external, and they're called external by economists because their value, which it cannot be captured by the individual investment. It leaks out or it spills over into the wider society. So an example here is, well, when you get a college degree, your capability for being productive on the job increases, but you don't get all of that benefit in the form of a higher wage than if you went to high school, because a lot of that benefit goes to your coworkers who are also able to work better because they're working with you as a higher productivity person. Some of that benefit then goes also to your employer, and it spills over into national income. At least that's the theory, and I think it's relatively plausible. You know, that intelligence spreads, you can't capture it. The non-pecuniary benefits, economists don't generally work with other social scientists, to say nothing of arts and humanities people. If they did, I think there would be an enrichment of the definitions of what these non-pecuniary benefits are, but there's fairly good, emotional relationships, increased enjoyment. I mean, your life is not just about your salary, obviously. And so there are many effects that people consider to be benefits that cannot be quantified as wages. And then there's plenty of stuff going on with external benefits that, better democracy being the one that everybody talks about and that the Truman Report people were obsessed with as well. Okay, if you do move this away from just a sort of an economist structure and into the humanities, I did this when I was working with an economist on a book chapter about the conflict and overlap between economics and humanities views of what higher education is for. You get a whole bunch of other stuff in this blue that's probably fairly hard for you to read. And I just want to give you one example. I mean, these kind of stay the same. These really expand when you start to think about them, the non-monetary, the non-economic, the non-pecuniary benefits. So though I mentioned these already down here in bold, the ability to hear, understand, and ponder ideas in a serious way, in a non-reactive way, that come from other races, other genders, other cultures, people who speak other languages, just other family members that you dislike, a whole bunch of those kinds of barriers that we live with. And so that's an individual benefit in that it kind of makes you smarter in the crude sense. But it also has an external benefit in that it produces similar reactions in other people. And when you throw in the democratization of the intellect leading to pluralized epistemologies and equitable relations, in other words, we're no longer trying to force everybody into the same box, the same set of assumptions. And this is obviously a huge issue around trans rights and sexuality issues in general, where many people who are very reactive don't have the slightest experience in relation to what they're talking about, but cis people talking about trans people and so on. And so what this leads to, this conception, is this thing I'm calling the general deliberative capacity that increases peaceful conflict resolution, reduced coercion and violence, new ideas, other things. When you have a population that has, debate skills, but they're really just the cognitive skills of listening, processing, absorbing diverse information that does not actually cohere, at least the first 7 or 8 times that you try to figure out how these ideas go together. people who are comfortable with that in this model create more peaceful societies that do not have to resolve their conflicts through force. All right. So there's, I guess, a way that I would summarize this first part of the talk, and I'm just going to do this as a bit of a kind of a recital of this things that I think the university exists for in this expanded sense. And the first is universities exist to create public benefits, which are mostly, though not exclusively, non-monetary, by finding original and disseminating confirmed knowledge through a funding model that materially supports democratized intelligence. I'm going to say more what I mean about that as we go. Embodied in professional knowledge that integrates a range of fields. Universities bring different disciplines together. They don't divide them up into small certificate programs. Applied through the egalitarian principle of quality for all. So education is not about the rich getting cognitively richer and the poor staying where they are. That shifts society from established failed behaviors, which is the survival skill that I mentioned at the beginning, by forming personal capabilities for public deliberation and collective action on a mass scale. Okay, higher education helps people get jobs, but higher education is really about this whole set of values that is under-theorized and under-publicized, and that I'm suggesting would help our case with the public if we were able to talk about this whole thing. And I know it sounds, oh, this is too abstract for most people. I have never spoken to a student or a student's parent that did not understand. We're here to help your kid understand stuff in a way that will help them be happy. Everybody gets that, and everybody understands the ability that that takes, that can in fact be cultivated, that is not simply inborn. Okay, so what we have instead, I mean, this is the policy problem really, is we don't have all this stuff that it's just been dismissed as fluff, really kind of idiotically, and without a whole lot of actual equitable arguing about it. It's just been kind of waved away through economic anxiety and a bunch of other things we don't have time to talk about. And so this is the standard 2x2, which only has one cell in it. It's all private benefits. And they're all pecuniary. And universities are doing the kind of thing that Ohio State is trying to do. One of their professors published a book that showed that college is worth going to because you have a higher return on investment than, say, if you just put your money in a bank or even most hedge funds today. That the economic benefits of education are always greater than the direct and the indirect costs of college. And for most people, that is true, although it varies quite a bit how true that is and how big the increment is. My point here is just that, I mean, it's not wrong. It just obliterates all the other issues that would inspire people to actually support what it is that universities do. Okay, so anyway, this is the sort of the default framing. And what I want to do now is move on to how we're supposed to respond to this kind of stuff now, where we have this narrow understanding that's pretty much the one cell. How do we get the other three in there? And how do we get public officials to understand the need to actually fund that? Okay, so the policy framework is pretty tight. It's focused on ROI, and it has some metrics for what allows return on investment to seem like it's succeeding. And the defining metric for that is basically degree attainment. What percentage of a given population is not only starting university, but actually finishing it. And then this is broken out by racial groups and also by income. And so the social justice metric that gets kind of caboosed onto this is are we having some kind of progress in each group, including ones that have been very disadvantaged for a very long time? How fast is the progress? Are we ever going to even out? And so here's what the share of BA degrees looks like broken out by pan-ethnic group or by racial group. And you can see that there has been pretty significant progress if you're looking at the share of BA degrees in people that are 25 to 29 years old in each of these groups. So college stays, it's basically 90% white in the mid-70s, still 85% white 15 years later. But by the end of the next 30-year period, the white share has dropped to 2/3. There's been a near doubling of African-American college attainment. There's been a tripling with Latinos, and there's been a doubling with Asian Americans. And the case of stagnation is indigenous students who are 0.4. Now they've gone to 0.5 after having been kind of higher in the middle. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So this period was a period of, sort of genuine diversification. What does it look like if we compare these two in terms of the increase in degree attainment by racial group? So we have 1960 to 1990, and we have 1990 to 2020. Again, the same racial breakdown. And what we see is that basically it looks like almost everybody, again, except for indigenous students, did pretty well, right? So an increase there's a doubling for whites in 60 to 90, but pretty close to another doubling, 70% in the second period. Black attainment continues to increase at a kind of more than double. Latino attainment, this is a kind of an artifact, this number, of the fact that they didn't actually keep records before 1980 for Latino attainment. But nonetheless, it's a very significant increase. After that, Asian Pacific Islander increases by 1/3 is quite good considering how high it was to begin with. And again, we have a serious problem with American Indian, Alaskan Native attainment, which is that essentially, or during this period, it fell. Okay, so the question that we need to ask ourselves is, well, how do we interpret these numbers? And I think the preferred way of reading this is to say, well, both of these slides are actually good news. I mean, everybody, every racial group is doing better than they used to do. The progress seems to be pretty fast. The exception are indigenous peoples. So what we will do is sort of Bill Clinton style, we can do some targeted programs that are focused just on those folks and let everybody else fend for themselves because, look, they're doing pretty well. Okay, so this could be seen as a, like austerity leads to social justice. That's a possible interpretation. And I guess my argument would be that Republicans like that interpretation, but so do, in my experience, most mainstream Democrats, from Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom in California to what sounds like, from what you were saying before, Ned Lamont in Connecticut. It's fairly standard. Okay, so how do we point out what the problems are with this? How do we say, no, in fact, this is not? That inside of these numbers, the system is a kind of an inequality machine, that those of us who teach and learn in it have been struggling more and more over the last couple of decades, just with basic conditions, and that in fact they're amplifying racial and class distinctions rather than reducing them. Okay, so we have to first take a look at this, which is to add one detail to the chart that I already said, which is the funding. So the first thing there is to say is that, well, this great attainment, especially when it was 90% white, was that state funding per capita increased by 60%. And what we've seen in the last 30 years is actually kind of going up, but then ending up below in 2020, where the period started in 1990 in constant dollars. So this splits in a couple of ways. One is, again, to say, great, we're more efficient than we've ever been. This is sustainable. You've figured out how to produce these gains in attainment on the basis of basically flat funding for 30 years. So then again, this puts some pressure on us to say, well, wait a minute, there's more to this picture, and we have some other things that we want to tell you about. Okay, so here's the one place to start this. The sorry, I don't know if you can see these particularly well. This is Raj Chetty work from Opportunity Insights at Harvard, and these are the New York Times' versions of the research that he's done. One thing that you see is that elite schools, here I'm just taking liberal arts colleges as an example, have much higher attendance from people that already have a lot of money in their families and lower attendance for poorer people. Over here in the smaller chart, you have California state colleges. And what you see there is something that we would actually want to see. And that is that attendance stays pretty flat regardless of your family income. In other words, there's a fair amount of financial aid. There's been some effort to reduce the cost of attendance, although I would argue that students mostly manage to do this by working way too many hours. And the increases for the flagships in my old school UCSB are not anything like what we see over here, where it's pretty clear that this is a system that liberal arts, really devoted teaching that is primarily for upper income people. And, we have to then figure out how to respond to this. Okay, the one response came almost 10 years ago now from the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce. It produced a scathing report about inequality within the system that was called Separate and Unequal. And it starts with an image of how universities are beginning to imitate the segregation that you see in America's leafy suburbs, which themselves were rooted in sort of the Jim Crow era and the ongoing residential segregation that continues to afflict most parts of the country. So here's their summary of their findings. White students are increasingly concentrated in the 468 best funded schools that are also most selective, while African American and Hispanic students go to the other 3,250 schools that are open access, good, less well-funded, which is bad. And so what they're suggesting is that the post-secondary system is a dual system where we're back to separate and unequal, to name their title, the thing that Brown v. Board and a bunch of other earlier civil rights legislation and the civil rights movement itself was attempting to overturn. The argument of this center, which is a pretty mainstream center focused on economic benefits of higher education, is that we've instead created this kind of a stratification system, even if the aggregate numbers look pretty good. So here are some images from this report. This was updated in 2018 without any real change in the figures. 82% of whites go to the most selective, 72% of Latinos, 68% of Black students go to open access schools. Think, well, what's wrong with that, really? Because the good teachers are everywhere, et cetera. Well, what's wrong with it is that the most selective group spends 4 times, and this is actually an average, so the difference between a community college and a place like Stanford is an order of magnitude at least per student. So if you go to one of these places, you're getting, in dollars from 10 years ago, almost 30,000. You're getting 1/5 of that if you go to averaged out regional colleges. And again, you think, well, that's not good, but does it really have a practical effect? And the answer is absolutely. And so here's another chart showing that, again, if you look at students that have similar academic attainment, crudely represented by their SAT scores, what you see is similar students going to these differently funded systems have very different graduation rates or completion rates. I mean, it's pretty shocking that there's a 58% completion rate for students that are well prepared enough to have gotten over 1,200 on their SATs, while it's 87% at those selective colleges, and it approaches 95, 98% at the most affluent of those. Okay, so what has happened is this kind of a separation between these different systems, and it's tightly correlated to per student funding, which is kind of the third rail in Democratic parties that none of them really want to talk about. Another effect, again, from at this time from income and not racial group, is that we had a lot of funding in this period. It was kind of bouncing around. We had sort of less funding growth in this period, but more attainment in terms of racial access. And yet there's been essentially no closing, and in fact, to some extent, a widening of the class gap in higher education. So whatever we're doing in terms of austerity and efficiency and using better use of technology and so on is not working to do the thing that was supposed to be happening in higher education, which is equal opportunity leading to some kind of equitable outcomes, not exactly equal outcomes, something pretty close to it. I would say that based on this research, what we should conclude is that the cross-racial attainment boom owes a lot to the demographic boom that those population groups, Asian Americans, Latinos, have experienced, plus continuous social movement activism on the outside applying consistent pressure. And this has been particularly clear, at least in the minds of politicians, coming from the Black community. If you have a community that in fact doesn't benefit from either of those things, and that would be Native Americans, you have basically neglect without either the outside pressure or just the constant expansion of numbers. All right, I organized the many factors that are involved in explaining these kinds of charts in the book that was mentioned in the introduction into a cycle, which they'll be relieved to know we're not actually going to go through. The original sin is giving up on the material that I talked about in the beginning so that the public simply no longer knows that that's what college is really about, that total package of benefits. And what's happened in the time that I've been working on this, which is really about 20 years, pretty consistently, including doing sort of financial analysis of budget models at the university, is that everybody's just gotten used to it. So, in 2005, the idea that research, scientific research in particular, loses money for the university and that subsidies have to come from student tuition in order to backfill the inadequate support on indirect costs that are coming from outside sponsors. People were upset about that and people really tried to cover it up, and there was kind of a discourse. Now it's just like, same with large regular tuition hikes. There's been pressure in California and other states to stop doing that. So there's been kind of a lid put on that by the political system. But people are just, kind of fatalistic. Increased student debt, this started really the best social movement of the last 15 years or so, and it got all the way to the White House before it was nullified, at least temporarily, by the courts. But it's just kind of become baked into people's thinking about the system. These two here are particularly serious if we have become truly complacent and truly just resigned to them. The US used to lead the world in bachelor's attainment in the 70s and the 80s. Its only competition were Canada and the Soviet Union. And since then, it's kind of middle of the pack. Other countries have caught up and surpassed us. And the rate of growth has also declined, in part because of what we saw in this last slide with lower income people. Basically, the lower half of the population by income improving not at all in terms of the over 70 years in terms of their attainment rates, just a tiny improvements. So that's an interesting thing because it's supposedly we live in a knowledge society or a knowledge economy where our productivity growth and our wealth depends on innovation as, at least in part, developed by higher education access. And we're just kind of, oh, well. The same with productivity growth. It's been really bad for all but about 3 years of this neoliberal period that started in the 1990s. Policymakers are just not making the connection between problems within higher ed and the possible diminishment of social intelligence that higher ed produces inside, and then poor productivity growth on the outside. I mean, it's another non-conversation. So my feeling about this after having worked on this for a long time is that the one where we have the most chance of making a difference, and the one that I think, at least from my point of view, is ethically the place to start, has to do with the reduction in educational quality for students that are not going to blue chip places. And the injustice, the social injustice, and also the intellectual injustice that is part of that. So as a result, or as a result of these thoughts that I've been having over quite a bit of time, and also my experience of working in a couple of different kinds of universities, I developed sort of a, I don't know, just put this table together to talk about things that seem to me to be important for learning, and then to what extent did we find them in different types of universities. And this is a kind of an unpleasant comparison to make, because it's kind of like rich and poor, or not, but although UCSB is actually not poor on the general scheme of things. And people are so worried about brand that we're very reluctant to talk any trash about our own institutions. And in England, where I currently am, you can actually get sanctioned for doing, putting the institution that you work in at reputational risk. But here are the learning elements that seem to me to be particularly important. Class size, which all teachers understand is crucial, and which all non-teachers are very skeptical about. Seminars, how many of these kinds of courses do you get in a cycle? Can you get timely and also individualized help with issues? Can you engage actively in discussion, even if you're a shy person, or is it just the class so big that just a few people that are really comfortable talking, are they able to talk? Do we get engagement for all? We're getting mastery learning in the sense that all the students learn all the material and all the students can engage in it, or not? Can we do intensive problem solving? Can we get constant feedback? Can we get intensive feedback? And then an issue that came up before, can students get actual access to the courses that they need in order to graduate? And then the second order question, can students get access to those courses in an intellectually coherent sequence that allows them to progress through their studies such that their knowledge accumulates rather than just is kind of scattered across the wall? Okay, so I'm a graduate of Reed College. These conditions I never saw again, well, after graduate school anyway. Almost all my classes were discussions, and I just got massive help, including when I wrote a senior thesis, which all Reed students have to do, spending an hour or two every single week in the office of my long-suffering advisor, who I didn't realize at the time was a contingent faculty member and was constantly trying to find another job, even as he had a load of 12 senior thesis students that he was supervising. So Reed has gradually managed to create an infrastructure so that it doesn't have to be heroic overwork on the part of one individual to make this kind of system work. The intellectual benefits are absolutely enormous. UCSB, it was better and now it's worse. I mean, that's the story. So all of these, the answers to all these questions turn to no. What University of California students are really good at, and maybe I bet your students are good at it too, is forming study groups where they help each other because they don't have professors to help them. They cannot get access even to teaching assistants much of the time. This issue of intensive feedback was particularly important to me because I got my PhD in American literature, and for the first 3 years of graduate school, I taught composition, and I mostly taught it to engineers. I taught one section a semester. I had 17 students. Those 17 students wrote a 5-page paper every single week, and I graded every single sentence of every one of their papers with an egg timer, but nonetheless, I got through it, and I gave them the kind of intensive help that I've gotten emails later from them thanking me for, because I mean, I didn't know what I was doing. It wasn't any skill on my part, but the process of bearing down on the details created an intensity of learning, an acceleration of learning that they felt clear benefits for throughout their lives. At UCSB, our graduate students have 50 students, not 17. They assign one paper every 5 weeks, and they cannot grade every single sentence. So the learning intensity between a first-year Cornell student, which is where I was, and a first-year UCSB student, equally deserving people of attention and intellectual development, are vastly different. And it's just, oh, we can't make every school Cornell University. Well, that's exactly what we should be aspiring to in terms of the pedagogical values that we have that I'm going to turn to in a second. Okay, so there is a reconstruction cycle in the book that was mentioned. Again, I'm just going to talk about this. Can we do a couple of things at once? Start explaining to the wider public, starting with our students, the benefits of intensive learning cognitively, politically, socially, and all of its dimensions sort of in an integrated way. And then secondly, can we articulate for ourselves, for our colleagues, and then for the university and the society, what we mean by something like intellectual capabilities. So what I did was I made a list of what I thought were important things for basically every single student, my version of mastery learning, that gets a BA in my field, that every single one of them should have. I don't care if they're getting Ds or As, they should all have some access to each of these skills. And then the claim that I've already made, which I'm happy to defend, is that this then has a massive social benefit, a social multiplier that we too often underestimate. Knowledge of what a research question is. Most people don't know exactly what one is talking about. And the level of public discourse is affected by that. Basic subject knowledge is, of course, the thing that we think we're doing with our majors, and it is what we in fact are doing. What are the questions? What are the history of the questions that history or chemistry, whatever the field is, has traversed through? 3, developing a capacity for being interested in questions where the answer is non-obvious. Most of us panic when we can't figure something out in a relatively short time. And one of the things that college does is teaching us to work through that so that we can think pretty carefully. I taught a course in detective fiction where every single book has multiple examples of a detective being faced with this horrible crisis, panicking, having their minds go blank, and then having to calm themselves down and work through a reasoning process that allows them to figure out what's going on. 4, ability to acquire into one's own core interests. When I've asked students, well, what's your intellectual interest? Most of them don't know really what I'm talking about. When I explain it, they're very interested, and then they come up with great stuff. And then half of the people that I've asked over the course of my career said, you were the first person in my life to ever ask me that question. I said, not your parents? They said, especially not my parents. So this is something that people have to come to university for. They're getting crammed with stuff in high school. This is where the capabilities of use really start to blossom if we have the right conditions for it. Developing a research question, identifying a thesis. How many of your students are great on topics and not so great on saying what their thesis is about the topic? I mean, I certainly struggle with that. And it's the kind of skill that that again is of individual benefit and also socially essential. Planning and investigation. How do you actually inquire into something? It's not obvious. It's hard, and it changes with every question. How do you organize research? Number 8. How do you interpret research results, especially when things don't add up? I mean, again, it's a crisis. And one of the things that college does is help people move through that crisis. And it's got enormous benefit in stressful emotional situations, family situations, et cetera, but it also is essential for research and for solving the critical problems of our age. 10, development of the analysis narrative into a coherent narrative. This is basically what this talk is about. How do we have a coherent narrative about what happens in the black box of the classroom? public and social presentation of findings, responding to criticism, availability to reformulate, and the ability to fight opposition, to develop within institutions, to negotiate with society, to seek power for the correct results that you believe in as the result of your research. All of those things they're connected. And again, my view is that this is something that absolutely every college graduate in the United States should have access to and continue to develop, at least have a basis for it before they graduate. Okay, so here's just wrapping up. What I'm suggesting is that we work towards a kind of, well, we don't work towards, we just do. We just have to start doing educational budgeting from below. So it works. We get budgets and then we figure out what kind of teaching we can do with the budget that we're stuck with. Should reverse that and reverse it only as an exercise, at least in the beginning, as an experiment. So we define the intellectual capabilities for all as a regulative ideal. We say what those are. So yours are not going to be the same as mine, the ones that I just put up. Then because we live in institutions and departments, we know a lot about how they operate. We define the institutional conditions for delivering them to all students. That means students, faculty, staff, frontline staff in particular, construct the conditions, articulate the conditions where this would happen. I personally think this is going to mean a massive movement to equalize funding across institutional types. So that would be, UConn and the other system colleges moving together, and not by bringing UConn down, but by bringing the other colleges up. What kind of faculty do we need? What are their teaching loads? Can you really do cognitive development if you're teaching 8 courses a year? I mean, that's not a rhetorical question. It depends on how many students are in each. How many students can you properly teach? Is it 17? Is it 50? What is it? Can technology help? We're the ones that have to answer those questions. And then when we identify the costs, this thing here, which doesn't even have a bullet, and then pursue the quality education budget that we have articulated for our institutions, starting with the department, over 5 or 10 years. I spent, on my last year at UCSB, I was chairing the Council for Planning and Budget for the Academic Senate again. And I begged the deans in the College of Arts and Sciences to do this, just do this exercise. And the one who was the most interested said, well, I think it would look a lot like our budget that we had in 2003. And I said, well, that's cheating, because what you need to do is start from where you are and the students you have right now and work backwards and figure out, should they have 1 seminar a year, 1 seminar a quarter, 2 in 4 years? What is it? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that educational experts should be the ones that are answering. Okay, so here's the wrap. I don't know that I should just read through this. Basically, higher education is a mixture of financial and non-financial effects. The non-financial are much more important to society at large, and they are probably more important to the individual. The wage is just the tip of the iceberg, and that's the only thing that we see. When we don't talk about public good benefits to our students, to anybody who will listen, we are part of this massive 30 years of miseducation of the public about what we do. And we are making half of our value invisible, which is the thing that really kills me. You can't fund this properly if you don't even know what the total value is. We need non-market sources, basically the state, to fund non-market effects that cannot be properly supported on the basis of return on investment calculations, because the investment does not return to the person who's paying. That's just how non-pecuniary effects work. We have a situation in which for the last 20 years, society has become basically inured to this struggling system, and the poll results show that they don't like it very much anymore. But nonetheless, they just feel like there's not that much they can do, and there are much bigger problems, from Ukraine to climate to the price of gas to whatever it is. And so the last part of this here is what I really would like to emphasize. I think we really need to, instead of being intimidated out of saying, this is about thought, this is about intellectuality. Every single one of my students is an intellectual while they're in my class. We should not be intimidated out of saying that. We need to say it. We need to say it to our students. Again, gotten mostly positive reactions from actual students when I say that. I am treating you as an intellectual here. That's what we do. And then try to expand it as a regulative ideal for both the budgeting and the political process. And then there's the concretization. There's the creation of the spreadsheets. There's putting the numbers to it. There's making people really understand what it's going to cost, and then building a pathway 5 years, 10 years to actually getting it. Okay, I know this is a lot of work. It's going to be a struggle. They're going to call us crazy. It's going to be a fight. Basically, every step is going to be a battle. But my conviction is that if we really fight for this university, this is the university that we will have in 5 or 10 years' time. Thanks.
Thank you, Christopher. Any questions for Christopher as we wait for lunch to show?
I'm glad I didn't trample on lunch.
So you have to just say whatever the audience says.
Okay. Any? Christopher, is there any way that we can get the slides to your presentation today?
Yeah, of course. I'll send them to Louise.
Okay. Any other questions? David. Is there any chance that Harvard, is that what you said, would give up its money to the community colleges?
No, but there is a chance that politicians could start taxing endowments or start doing some other sort of tax structure around property that major university landlords like, Columbia and Harvard, Yale have.
Michael.
I mean, there are tax solutions to this for sure. It's just they've been off the table for so long that we forgot they exist.
Did you hear that, Christopher? No?
No, I can't hear it.
Okay.
No.
Did you ever get any administrations to acknowledge and understand about the importance of smaller classes and what that means in terms of student success? Was especially in the first 2 years?
Yes. I've gotten every administration to understand this. I mean, they already understand it. It's not like a brilliant argument on my part. It's just they don't prioritize it so that they find the money to fund it. And there's a kind of an urgency, I think, that needs to be injected into this. And you all may have better ways than I do of making people feel urgently about this.
Greg. Any examples, Christopher, of institutions that have moved the ball in terms of what you're talking about today?
Not public ones that I know of. I mean, there's a struggle going on at UC Santa Cruz around class sizes, but it's been painful and difficult. No, I mean, everything has been going in the same direction for, I don't know what, 25 years, 30 years now. We started getting cut in the early 90s and the early 2000s, then 2008. Then there was a pandemic cut that only got partially backfilled. So essentially it's just been very reactive. And now my colleagues are telling me that they're getting set up for further cuts this coming year. That's why I think basically what I'm suggesting is we need a new narrative and we need a completely different reframing, and we can't get to where we want to go from where we are now. So it sounds a bit pie in the sky, And I always feel like I'm doing a bit of heavy breathing, when I'm talking to myself about this stuff. But I think that that's exactly what we have to do. We have to face the embarrassment of sounding excessively idealistic. And all I think that really comes to is starting with our own values and just believing in them enough so that we think that they could be real. They could run the institution. And then figuring out what the process is whereby our values become the ruling values of the institution. And it's one step at a time, and it's hard work, but it's doable. I just think most of the time, and this is really true of UC faculty, my beloved colleagues, pretty much not on the field, right? I mean, there's a minority of people that fight because that's how they're made, or and there's the majority that just have, given up a long time ago, and those folks need to be brought back into the game.
Mike?
Yeah, one more question about what about the problem we face with the professionalization of so many and that we're hiring faculty that aren't committed as much or understand as much the need for liberal arts and that balance in general education, all of that. Has that been a big problem that you see?
Christopher, the question is, what do we do with the issue and the problem of the sort of explosion of professionalization and so many different degrees, and how do we get folks to sort of understand the importance of general education? Is that what you said, Mike? Liberal arts degrees.
Well, there's one argument that's out there, and then there's a second one that needs to be made. The one that's out there is you need larger, big picture skills, creative capabilities, to use Martha Nussbaum's term, in order to deal with all of the challenges of a flexible career of the kind that most people have now. So the very specific training is not going to last for very long. And you can see this in computer science. I mean, their data science programs are absolutely swamped with students. But then if you look at them in 5 or 8 years later, some of them are being laid off so that those companies can hire the people that were just trained in the programming language or the techniques that are cutting edge right now. So I think that's true for health administration, a whole bunch of fields. They keep changing, and the faster the movement is in the field, the more you need general, you're calling liberal arts skills rather than particular vocational training. The second argument came up in a perverse way in this book, Academically Adrift, that maybe some of you read. It came out 12 years ago. Richard Arum and Josiah Roxa were the authors. It got enormous press attention, particularly in the Wall Street Journal, because what it said, the headline was, colleges are producing limited learning. Students are going, they're having a good time, they're paying for the party, but they're not most of the time really learning all that much. And what Arum and Roxa did was they used this instrument called the College Learning Assessment to test first years and fourth years to see if there was cognitive gain, and they didn't really find that much. Okay, so then they published a breakout paper after all that. It came out, I don't know, like 6 months later, and I read it and maybe 5 other people. And what that paper said, what it did was it broke down the limit, the learning that they were assessing by discipline. And the takeaway was the liberal arts and the liberal sciences, that is the traditional, chemistry, physics, history, et al., had no problem with limited learning. All of the problems with weak results came from vocational courses and from business administration of various kinds. In other words, those add-on courses that universities are desperately marketing to students because they think students only are thinking about wages and they want something practical that will pay when I'm 22 and not when I'm 25, were the least effective in terms of intellectual development. And the most effective were what we call college. So Aram is now the dean of the education college at Irvine, and I had a fellowship there in 2018 and hounded him a little bit about redoing this study because, in part because he didn't really correct anybody. It was widely misinterpreted, and we need new results, and we need a great expansion of that empirical evidence. And correct me if anybody knows that this is wrong, but he hasn't done it, and I haven't seen any new work that would continue that tradition, that would really compare the core to the new and talk about what real learning is, and then fund the real learning and not the stuff that's not working.
Any other questions? I have one, Christopher. If we think about social movement building around education, and yeah, we can talk about student debt and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, in the state of Connecticut, there's no coherence around higher education, public higher education in the state. And the question, and maybe one can dream, how would you build a movement around students sort of taking control of their education and thinking that through in such a way that it would put a bit of a pushback against all of these, these sort of corporate entities that want to grab public higher ed money, and also just, the nonsense that ultimately sort of passes for education today?
I think what we do as teachers is talk to them about the connection between their intellectual and their personal goals, starting in the classroom, but also moving out from there. And we can help them see the tensions between what it is that they're supposed to accept and what it is that they actually want. I think that's really I don't want to make it sound like it's one person at a time, but it kind of is not TikTok, right? It's really not pushing out media messages. It's working with people. And the great thing about our jobs is that we work with a lot of people, directly, and they're in front of us and we know them. And, we have an ability to converse about these kind of deeper issues and get them to do the sort of consciousness shift that is part of becoming an activist. I don't know what else, but obviously they have to read and they have to, do their own thinking and talking to other students. But, the first person that I heard speak, the student who tried to do some consciousness raising with your governor, that what she said should just be part of the constant conversation about college. And that, and then the next evolution of that idea about what she wants out of it, and multiply that by the students in the school. I think that's how movements get going. It's just, we can do this is what we want, and we can get it, and here are the steps that we're going to follow to get there.
Okay. One more, Kat.
So there's two exercises, and like basically the time to go for that is where started trying to educate the students how where do
Christopher, a question about any advice that you would give students in terms of how do they begin to sort of organize and movement build?
I would,
Yeah,
I mean,
and when students are working full time, going to school full time, right? Like, how do they do that?
talking to each other after class, in class, working with student government. I mean, that's one existing organizational structure that students could push. And, that's cyclical, but I've seen years where student government was really quite effective about preventing tuition increases, for example. I mean, that's the other thing. Suddenly there's mobilizations. They take place on the basis of a lot of invisible work that none of us know about, that is just students meeting in in the student center by the candy machine, et cetera, and getting conversations going. In 2009, 2011, and 2014, the undergraduate students, mostly of the University of California, essentially ended tuition increases. And it took 3 movements of coming out. But the 2011 really pretty much blocked it. They won over Jerry Brown. And then 2014 killed tuition increases. And now universities are only doing, cohort increases. None of the campuses can raise residential tuition. So I mean, students are actually quite powerful, and I think it's a question of focusing on the most essential issues. The issue has been student cost historically. I think needs to happen now is educational quality. What do students really want out of college in terms of intellectual development? That is going to also help them with jobs, but that is separable from that.
All right, Christopher, thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time. And please be in touch if I can be of any help. I'll send the slides to Louise.